Welcome back. It's that time of year when our idyllic beaches are stained red. That is red tide, dead fish, turtles, and other sea life, skin rashes, breathing problems for some, and lots of questions, especially when there are sewage spills. And is it connected or not? The Tampa Bay Times calls it the sliming of Florida River, noxious green algae fed by discharges from Lake Okeechobee polluting the Caloosahatchee River. Are they somehow connected? Joining us for more are ABC 7 Chief Meteorologist Bob Harrigan, Larry Stoltz, President of Sarasota Baywatch, and Sandy Gilbert, of CEO of START. And let me start with you, because you heard the quote from Moat basically saying that in summary, the relationship between freshwater outflows and existing Florida red tide blooms is extremely complex and far from clear-cut. Do you agree?
From their standpoint, I agree, because as a scientist, they're looking at all kinds of technical data. I'm looking at results. I'm looking at what causes what and trying to make a difference. And from my view, it's really not terribly complex. And what I simply mean is red tide has to have a certain water temperature. It gets it around here in general. Red tide has to get a certain salinity. It generally falls within that range around here. When it goes from those few that we normally would see if we took a liter of water out in the Gulf, maybe 1,000 per liter at the most, what changes it? What makes it become a bloom? And the answer is some big nutrient source. So that's where I want to focus. What can we do about the big nutrient sources? And the Caloosahatchee you mentioned is one of them.
But Bob, we are dealing with this every time, this time of year. How much worse is red tide this year as opposed to last year when we talked?
Well, I tell you, the last year we didn't have as much. It was sporadic, it was spotty, but this year in particular, not so much in North Sarasota and Manatee counties. It's now down near the Caloosahatchee. It's down near Boca Grande as well. A little bit more prevalent there. In fact, some people saying it's one of the worst ones they've seen in that area. There's not a lot of data that goes back many years to compare it to, but we're getting more and more samples each and every year. We'll have a little bit better base to follow where red tide is. And the red tide typically fall and winter is when it peaks and is usually strongest. So it's a little unusual to get it now, but it does need the warm water, obviously, and sunlight helps. And it's interesting, this particular, I've been reading up on a little bit, this particular bloom, and the cells actually can eat 12 different things. I mean, it's voracious in their appetite, and they move to where the source is.
You know, Larry, we talked about, I believe it was last year or maybe the year before, when there was a sewage spill in St. Petersburg, and there was concern that it flowed down here and it made the red tide worse. Scientists are always reluctant to go there, but the rest of us somehow see 1 and 1 equals 2.
Well, there are a lot of variables, and there is some complexity, but if you talk to the old working watermen, there is, in their minds, a pretty clear correlation between increased nutrient flow either from stormwater runoff during the wet season or from sewage spills or big outflows from Lake Okeechobee, and that provides nutrients that then helps draw the red tide in from the Gulf of Mexico into the bays.
Okay, our conversation on red tide continues. Welcome back. We're talking about red tide and the great toxic slime outbreak of 2018. And joining us for more are ABC 7 Chief Meteorologist Bob Harrigan, Larry Stoltz, President of Sarasota Baywatch, and Sandy Gilbert, CEO of START. Bob, let me start with you. How often do you get phone calls from people who are viewers or even visitors about reporting red tide and the impact?
Well, I can tell you this, with social media now, the response is so much quicker, and you really get the feeling is that people are worried about this, they're concerned about it, and want to know more about it. And social media is a big factor, and I can tell you that our #1 stories on our web and on social media is red tide. When we post a story about red tide, people want that information. They absorb and take that information in, because that is what we're all about here along the west coast of Florida, is enjoying our area beaches and our resources and our natural resources. And if that's a problem and people go to the beach, then they're disappointed if they didn't find out about where the red tide is or or they came out thinking that the red tide was gone and it was there. And that's an issue that we have to deal with, I think, more and more is communicate that to the people. I know we get reports from the FWC every Friday is their main full report. Then we get a midweek report on Wednesdays. But we also there's an app now that comes out that you can kind of follow that as well as far as beach reports go. MODA's doing some good things with it too as far as getting the information out.
I want to talk about the politics of this all a little bit later and the impact on tourism, but first let's get to the heart of the matter. Adam raised in his story, and so did the man that he interviewed, about whether or not this could be connected to the what's coming out of Lake Okeechobee. I know it's a complicated issue, but there are folks like we saw in Adam's story who say, look, I can guarantee you every time there's a discharge, 10 days later, red tide gets worse.
Absolutely, and it's a problem. You know, we have an imbalance now. We've lost a lot of mangroves, we've lost a lot of seagrass compared to prior times, and a big issue for us at Sarasota Bay Watch is shellfish. Shellfish are the cleaners of the bay, and without the scallops that we used to have and the clams we used to have, and the clams actually eat red tide, they could help protect our local inland waters.
You are both proposing and actually doing, planting shellfish in those areas to eat the red tide. I would imagine they would never be edible to us, but it's a step.
It is a step, and they can be edible. They clear out the toxins after a few weeks. Sarasota Bay Watch this summer is putting in 250,000 adult clams into Sarasota Bay as a pilot project, and if we're having great success so far, and we hope to scale that up and repopulate not only our bay, but sister bays.
And Sandy, just real quickly, you respond to the man in Adam's story who says, 10 days later, every time after a discharge, we see the impact.
I've heard the same thing for years from Sanibel and all those places. The only thing I would say, it's not the algae. The algae are different. The green slime algae is not red tide. It's a different species. But they both get fed by nutrients. And so the point is they're linked in that the nutrients coming out of that Lake Okeechobee, the green algae uses it, so does the red tide.
Okay, we are just getting warmed up. Our conversation on red tide will continue after a quick break. Welcome back. We are talking about red tide and the great toxic slime outbreak of 2018. Joining us for more are ABC 7 Chief Meteorologist Bob Harrigan, Larry Stoltz, President of Sarasota Bay Watch, and Sandy Gilbert, CEO of START. Bob, we were talking during the break about how things have improved because we as a community have done certain things, like there are fewer septic systems in the Sarasota area. Also, the ban on fertilizer this time of year, it has had a certain impact that has made the problem a little less worse than it used to be.
That's what it seems to be. Okay, that's what it seems to be. The case is, back in the 90s, late 90s, the outbreak was much more significant. I mean, we had dead fish covering the entire bay, fish washing up on all the beaches on Siesta Key, not just a little bit either. They would bring a bulldozer out and actually had to scoop the fish up. There were so many dead fish on Siesta Key. Now, you can imagine folks coming to visit, oh my gosh, I'm going to the beach. No, they're going to the death pool of fish, basically. So the restrictions that are put on fertilizers, great thing. I think that's the key. Of at least controlling it somewhat and not allowing it to spread as rapidly as we've seen is, taking care of what we put in the Gulf of Mexico. This is the most valuable resource we have, obviously, and if you, put junk in, it can cause a lot of problems.
And Larry, look, our local economy is at stake here. I would imagine that this can have a huge impact on tourism, and people are very sensitive to that.
Absolutely. There's health issues and there are tourism issues, and for Sarasota Bay Watch, we're all about restoring and protecting the bay. It's our own backyard, and we all need to pitch in and keep it as clean as we can. And one of the benefits of that may be reduced red tide impacts.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the political implications, as Adam spelled out, in terms of big sugar and our politicians. That's a really sensitive area. It's the reason why, correct me if I'm wrong, Sandy, that some of our scientists are really reluctant to talk about this because there's a lot of money and politics at stake.
Well, again, scientists generally don't wish to get into politics. It's not what they do. The issue is, if you're going to take care of Lake Okeechobee, you have to have land south of it to run the water into, clean it in that water through STAs and various things that will clean it, and then put it into the Gulf of Mexico. We're not doing that. We're running it directly into
Why
the
aren't we doing it?
Because there is no facility there. They've just approved C-43 reservoir. It's been on the books for 20 years. It's a reservoir that would take water that goes directly into the Caloosahatchee, holds it for a while. nutrients percolate down, and then it runs down into the Caloosahatchee. That will be a help. It's only a part solution, but that thing has just been finally approved after being talked about for 20 years.
And we saw a picture there when you were speaking. It was a color-enhanced satellite imagery of all the algae bloom in Lake Okeechobee, and it looked like it covered about 80% of the entire lake at that point. So it's a big problem.
Are we getting to the tipping point that the politics of this is about to change? Because as Adam pointed out in his story, you have two men running for governor. Chris King is a Democrat, Ron DeSantis is a Republican. They're both vowed not to take money from Big Sugar, whereas a lot of other politicians have. If this keeps going, is it going to somehow force Big Sugar to, you know, spend the money for these facilities and look at other ways to handle these discharges?
Well, Big Sugar's already agreed to sell the land years ago that we want. Then they changed their mind and wanted a higher price, and the government walked away. So the issue is Big Sugar must be involved. We need the land to run the water over it, filter it, and what else happens? The Everglades are starving for water, and the reason they don't get any water because all the water that would run out of Lake Okeechobee doesn't meet the specs. It would pollute the Everglades. So you run it over this reservoir area and these stormwater treatments area. You keep the nutrients out of our rivers, and you aquify the Everglades. It's a win-win, but it's millions and millions of dollars, and there's reluctance.
You know, Bob, how often do people conflate these two issues, what's happening with Lake Okeechobee and red tide that we've been talking about? It's very easy, as we've been talking, to talk about somehow linkage of it. You know, is there a lot of public education that really has to take place here? I
think so. I mean, for one thing, I know that people want to talk about it as not red tide, as a harmful algae bloom, as opposed to red tide. It has nothing to do with tides. And it's red in color, certainly it is, but education is the key, I think. You know, even I learned a little bit just studying up on this, is that these things are voracious as far as eating. I mean, they have 12 different sources of food, and they can eat in the bottom, the middle of the water column, or the top of the water column. They're very active in what they do, and so it's going to be hard to control. You can't get rid of them altogether. I think that's the point. I think the important point is that we have to stop polluting and adding nutrients for these things to grow and become bigger blooms.
And I think it's also worthwhile pointing out that it's not just a simple correlation. There are a lot of complexities, and we now have some federal money. You know, Congressman Buchanan has $8 million just brought in earlier this month to specifically study this issue. And so that will help as well. I'm sure there'll be an educational component, there'll be a research component, and then there'll be some remediation components, I'm sure, that come out of that.
What do we have to do better in terms of being able to communicate to the public where red tide is on a daily basis and what areas to avoid?
I think we have to talk about the whole health of the bay. One of the problems I have with START is raising money. When red tide's here, they all call, they're all interested, they can't do enough. Red tide's not always here. It goes away, now there's no reason to take care of the bay. We have everyday reasons. Red tide's the cancer. There are many other things like seagrass and other types of things that less nutrients make it a better bay for all of us. People don't know that. They only know about the cancer, red tide, and then they're interested. When it goes away, they go back to their life. We need to communicate that.
And to your point of getting the red tide out, we know we have our mysuncoast.com. We write the articles when they come out. We kind of put them up and put them in a little bit more readable form. And we also, I noticed this past weekend, I put it on our weather app, you know, and our weather app, I put out a little, and it was the most hit story on the weather app all weekend long. Not the weather, but that particular story, which showed the last report from the FWC. So just letting people know on a daily basis about the red tide. I think a little bit more updates on the red tide instead of just bi-weekly and at the end of the week.
And when we're talking about the green slime from Lake Okeechobee, I can't remember a period of time when there's been more reporting about it. You are seeing stories from around the state. As I mentioned, the Tampa Bay Times just wrote a big column, The Sliming of Florida. As I said, they are calling it the Great Toxic Slime Outbreak of 2018. This is unusual.
Well, it impacts tourism, certainly, but there's also local commerce. With red tide particularly so bad down in the Boca Grande area, the commercial aquaculturists, the clam farmers down there, are not allowed to harvest their crop. And so I know some clam farmers who have gone to Georgia to build houses because they can't work the agricultural leases that they have.
And it's a matter of health and safety, and we talked about the impacts in terms of you know, eyes and breathing, but also a local man died recently by eating shellfish that local shellfish that he should have stayed away from.
That wasn't red tide, I believe. It was a bacterium. Right. But what does bacterium feed on? It's back to the nutrients. It was just another species of something that was bad because the water wasn't clean enough. That's the water's clean, you're not going to get bacteria from an oyster. Right.
The one thing we haven't seen recently, at least not reported, is, you know, unlike last year when there was that big sewage spill, we haven't really seen that. So when it comes to red tide, it's not easy to say this just happened, so this is now
the correlation
happening.
is not there. It's interesting to note that the Manatee County southward, mainly North Sarasota, there hasn't been a whole lot of red tide yet. The flow is put out, and they show kind of where the red tide is going to be moving from USF. They have a map that they put out as well, and I sometimes show that as where it's going to be moving. But the correlation between the sewage spill up in St. Pete was quite evident to me. I mean, you know, like you said, you saw the sewage spill, you saw the red tide come up stronger, and even more so where that flow was going, right downstream into Manatee County and eventually Sarasota. I can tell you that you can eat fish that are caught as long as they're alive. You get the red tides on the outside of the fish, but it does have a big impact on commercial fishermen as well as guides that go out each and every day. They have to look for areas that there is no red tide because you don't want to be, you know, fishing around bad dead fish.
One of the big arguments from people is that, oh, it couldn't have anything to do with comes off the land from nutrients because red tide starts out there. Well, they just did a report on the oil spill, following it up. I'm not saying it has anything to do with red tide, but in the process they studied 15 areas of the Gulf, the one right near the oil spill, and 14 others. Net, what did they find? It's all over the Gulf.
Okay, we have to leave it there. We want to thank our guests, ABC 7 Chief Meteorologist Bob Harrigan, Larry Stoltz, the President of Sarasota Baywatch, and Sandy Gilbert, CEO of Start